the phenomenon that we nowadays call compression. Now, the essential point about compression is that we change the number of syllables. It's an optional process where we can reduce the number of syllables by changing something that's syllabic into something that's non-syllabic. We change either a weak vowel into the corresponding semicolon, or we change a syllabic consonant into the corresponding non-syllabic consonant. So, in these examples on the board, we have a kind of choice between saying lenient, 3 syllables, lenient, or saying lenient, 2 syllables, lenient. We have a choice between saying influence, 3 syllables, influence, or squashing it into 2 syllables, influence, influence. Something that rattles can be described as rattling, 3 syllables, or as rattling, 2 syllables. If you prefer one thing over another, you express a preference, 3 syllables, preference, or in 2 syllables, a preference. Now, again, these pronunciations are both available to everybody. It's not that some people say one and some people say the other. It's that we have them both at our disposal. The longer form tends to be used when we're speaking particularly slowly, clearly, deliberately. If we're using a word for the first time in a discourse, if it's an unfamiliar word. Whereas the compressed form, the shorter form, tends to be used if we're speaking rapidly, colloquially, if it's a word we've used before in the discourse, if it's a familiar word. On the handout we've got slightly different examples, and in particular we've got a phrasal example, because the same thing can happen in a phrase like, don't be a fool. Now there, be a, 2 words, can be said as 2 syllables, don't be a fool. But we can compress it in just the same way as lenient can become lenient. So don't be a fool can become don't be a fool. Don't get, and we've lost the syllable. Don't be a fool. Don't be a fool. Now notice that this phenomenon of compression happens only when the vowel after the place we're talking about is a weak vowel. In all of these it's schwa, it's lenient, don't be a fool. And that's by far the most typical environment when it occurs. Sometimes before weak vowel I, the other weak vowels really hardly occur in this environment. Let's have another example involving like in influence. Stand away! It's about to explode! It's about, now here's the pre-vocalic weak form of to. Before consonants it goes to to come. Before vowels it goes to with this neutralization that isn't exactly either long or short. It's about to explode, 3 syllables, to explode. But this is the kind of environment where you can get compression. It's one of these compressible segments followed by a weak vowel in, and therefore we can say it's about to explode. It's about to explode. It's about to explode. It's about to explode. Now, notice in a phrase like, there's something I want to ask. Something I want to ask. Can we compress the into W? Can we say something I want to ask? No, we can't, because R is strong. So in order to formulate the environments where you can do this compression, we do need the notion of strong versus weak vowels, because it only happens before weak vowels. We can say to explode, to announce, to adore, but we can't say twask, tweet, twenter. Only before weak vowels. Equally, we can say don't be a fool, don't be annoyed, but we can't say don't be angry. Because being angry is strong. Well, notice then at the bottom on the handout, I've said that only a subset of weak vowels can be an input to the compression. Now, when we're talking about rules in generative ethology, we speak of the input to a rule, the output from a rule, and the environment in which it takes place. The input to this rule is I or U or a syllabic consonant. Syllabic consonants, as we've seen, consist of schwa plus something else. So we can say that the input to the compression rule has to be I, U, or schwa. The output is the corresponding semivowel, or in the case of the syllabic consonant, the non-syllabic consonant. And in the environment, we notice this point that the following vowel must be weak, as in the examples we just had, and also, as in the ones we've got here, nice difference between radiant and to radiate. In each case we start radi, but in the case of the adjective radiant, we've got weak so we can compress into radiant. In the case of the verb to radiate, A is a strong vowel, so you can't compress, so radiate has to remain 3 syllables, you can't say radiate. Here's another example of the same thing, really. You may know the difference between verbs ending in ate, pronounced ate, and nouns or adjectives pronounced ut, or for an older generation, it. Anyhow, weakened. So the verb ending remains strong, noun and adjective weakens. So the verb is to separate, and the adjective is separate. But notice that the adjective is then a candidate for compression, because we go through the process of having becomes compresses to So separate becomes separate becomes separate. And that's how we usually pronounce the adjective separate. 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 But it does have another possibility, a slower form, separate. The verb has no such possibility, you can't say separate. It's got to be separate. Similarly with the verb to moderate, must be 3 syllables, to moderate, but the adjective moderate, and that can compress to moderate. So this seems to be an accurate generalization about the circumstances where compression can or can't occur. The main sort of problem that remains with compression is just how far we go along in recognizing it. There's a problem with some very common words, like several or every, where, to be honest, we normally pronounce them always as 2 syllables. Several, every. But as the spelling suggests, they certainly were once upon a time 3 syllables, several, and every. And the present usual pronunciation clearly derives from that by the process we've just been describing. But the thing is, with very frequent common words, naturally you always say them in the compressed form, and so the compressed form becomes the only form. And new generations of children only hear them in the compressed form, and they only learn them that way. Sometimes this has even been reflected in the spelling. Think about the spelling of the words angry. wintry. These clearly come from anger and winter, that's the ig ending. So angry gives you angry, wintry day gives you wintry. English people sometimes get these spellings wrong because they restore the uncompressed form. Conventional spelling requires angry, wintry and disastrous, but I often from native speaking students get the spelling with an E between the T and the R of disastrous because they are really relating it to disaster and therefore disastrous. And therefore you would predict the pronunciation disastrous. So there's a problem of lexicalization and historical change here. Here's some more examples of compression of the kind we spoke of. Me, weak form me. Tell me, before a weak vowel. Tell me a story, can compress to tell me a story. Tell me a story. Try saying it, tell me a story.
Tell me a story.
Tell me a story. Tell me a story. The train is about to arrive. About to arrive. About to arrive. You try it, the train is about to arrive.
About to arrive.
About to arrive. Okay, there's nothing wrong in saying about to arrive, but it's a slow and careful form compared with about to arrive. Same thing happening with syllabic N here. Out and about. And has a weak form. Gives you syllabic consonant. Out and about is compressible into out and about. Out and about. Out and about. Out and about. You can see how useful it is to think of these processes, then, applying one after another. To arrive at the pronunciation with n, out and about, we've got to go through weakening and weakens to n, loses its d. Syllabic consonant formation, n gives us compression, gives us a lot of these pictures around. There's a couple of minutes, becoming a couple of minutes. Syllabic L becomes non-syllabic. And there is the derivation set out for, well, some of it, for a neighbour of ours. Now, this involves the business of linking R as well. A neighbour of ours. Of weakens to of, form. Neighbour acquires linking R because it's followed by a vowel. Neighbour of. Schwa plus R gives you syllabic R, neighbour of. Syllabic R compresses to non-syllabic R, neighbour, or neighbour parts. And so we can explain this common pronunciation of this phrase by referring to the underlying processes.